aware that there are two things in between you and a cheese platter and some sweet dessert, and that's me and Ken. So I will try my best to be relatively succinct. But I want to talk to you a little bit about security and integrity of electronic exams. And I think Mathew picked us for this particular talk because at CQU we have some unique challenges in that we're a multi-campus university, and when we run an electronic exam, we need to be able to run it in Sydney, Melbourne, Gold Coast, not Gold Coast anymore, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Rockhampton, plus for a whole bunch of distance students as well. And so that gives us some interesting challenges when it comes to making sure that we have the integrity, we ensure the integrity of the exam. And it's really interesting this morning to listen again about the things from halfway across the planet and some of the big things that they're doing in terms of dealing with lots of students, in particular in Finland, with lots of students in lots of different locations and how they deal with that, because those are some of the issues that we've been dealing with trying to implement an electronic exam. So let's talk a little bit first and foremost about the security and integrity of electronic exams in general. So there's our considerations for all various institutions, for any institution. And then what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about what happened with us at CQU in particular. So when it comes to security and integrity, the first thing that we need to think about is sandboxing. And I think Mathew highlighted this idea of authenticity, of making sure that the student is the one that's actually doing the exam. And I said over lunch to somebody that I think that's often a little bit hidden. We don't like to talk about the fact that one of the reasons we're doing an exam is we want to make sure that the person that came to the unit for the entire term is the person that's actually sitting there in the exam. It's the person that knows the material, and it's not their father or their girlfriend or somebody else. And so we do that with a paper-based exam. And when you tell people that you want to do an electronic exam, we want to be able to do the same thing. We want to be able to make sure that it's the right person doing the exam. And we want to make sure that that person doesn't have any assistance that is not part of our planned environment. And we do paper exams because we can do that. We can tell them to put their mobile phone in their pocket, turn everything off, don't talk to anybody, and we can isolate them so we are confident that they're the one that's actually doing the exam. So when we think about security and integrity for exams, that's the first thing, one of the first things we need to think about is how are we going to make sure that that student is the one that's actually doing the exam. We also need to think about dealing with cheating. And it's interesting because I think I've heard both this morning. I've heard some people say that cheating is harder in an electronic exam, and I've heard some people say that cheating is easier in an electronic exam. And I suppose it depends on which way you look at it. You know, there were some concerns. I think David was raising some of the concerns that students had on our project, where they thought it was easier for students to look over, other students to look over their shoulder and see what they were doing. But then similarly, of course, it can be harder because you've got more effort to lock things down and to keep things off the desk and to limit what the students can actually do. So if you're confident in your e-exam system to be a lockdown system, you could argue that it is easier to, or it's harder for the students to cheat. Oops, sorry. Reliability is something else as well, and it's linked to this idea of security and all of those kinds of things. So we want to try and make sure that students are not involved in testing the exam, and we want to try and remove some of that anxiousness that David was talking about. And I think it was interesting, again, over the course of the day, that people have talked about that a lot, that students are anxious, that students are scared of the technology, and maybe it is just a tipping point thing. Maybe it is just that we need to get them to the point where that this is standard practice. And so again, certainly seems like they're getting to that direction in Finland. But for now in Australia, we have students that very much say, I'd prefer to do a paper-based exam because then I know my pen is not going to, crash. I'm not going to get the blue screen of death on my pen, but I might get it on my, oh, there we go, old-fashioned joke, Andrew. But I might have that trouble with my laptop. So we need to think about reliability, and that's an issue for us as well. the next point relates to that idea of eliminating student participation in the technology testing or the e-exam setup. And I mean, one way to do that, which you've heard this morning, is to take control of all of the computers. And so it's not BYOD, it's not bring your own device. Instead, you say, well, we'll give you the technology, and then we're more responsible for the technology. But the downside, as Mathew just said, is that it's hard to scale that once you start talking about running bigger and bigger exams. We need to think a little bit about systems integration and making sure that, that everything's integrated together really, really well. And then, interestingly, we also need to think about training our invigilators. I don't know about you guys, but at our university, most of the invigilators are older retired people. They're the kinds of people that do invigilation. And it may be stereotypical, but saying to them, oh, all of our students are going to bring all their laptops to the room, and maybe that you have to set up a local network, and if the student, make sure they've plugged in the Ethernet cable correctly and other lights on the router, might be a little bit challenging for those particular invigilators. And so we've got this extra challenge of training all of those invigilators. But I think ultimately what we want to do is we want to preserve a positive student experience. And I loved watching David talk this morning about what the students had said about the exam and about them being concerned and anxious about the electronic exam. And ultimately, I think we want the students to feel like they've had a positive experience. And if we come back to what Andrew was saying, I think, to me, the key there is pedagogy. The key is being able to say to students, there is some advantage in doing this exam. Can't you see there's value in doing it this way? I can tell you, after doing it a few terms at CQU, I think some of our students are starting to see that advantage. I can see that I might do better in the exam or be able to structure my answers better if I can type the exam. But again, I think that's a hard slog that takes us a little while. So what are some of the challenges we have in terms of security integrity at CQU specifically? Well, I already mentioned to you that we're a multi-campus institution. And so typically, if I run an e-exam in term 2, I have 160 students. So I had 160 students across how many exam centres, Ken? Maybe 7 or 8?
Yeah, up to 12.
Up to 12.
In fact, your deferred examination coming up next week is 7 exam centres.
7 exam centres for the deferred exam. He said 12 exam centres for the standard exam that we had last term. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and then all of those little distance students out there as well. You know, the single student in Broome and another student in Emerald. There might be 1 or 2 in Mount Isa. And so we have all of these USBs that are going out. And one of the challenges for us is that our university therefore got a little bit picky about providing spare laptops, about giving the students technical support during the exam, and that made things a little bit more challenging for us. Not necessarily in terms of security and integrity, but certainly in terms of that multi-campus environment. For that reason, our university has been talking for a long time about online proctored solutions. And if you've been in the exam game for a while, you'll know that if you mention to somebody that you do e-exams, one of the first things they say to you is, oh, is that where the students get to sit in front of a webcam? And you have to say, no, actually, it's not. It's still an invigilated exam. It still requires them to go to some sort of centre or have somebody watch them. It's just an electronic exam on a computer. But these things get mixed up by people, this idea of online proctoring versus an electronic exam. But our university, obviously, with that many exam centres, they would love the idea that instead of the students coming into campus, instead of having to get an invigilator in Mount Isa or in Broome to actually invigilate the exam, they would much prefer that we had an online proctoring solution. So they're looking at that at the moment and talking about how we're going to do that. And one of the reasons that they're doing that is because we have to send stuff all over the country currently. So we have invigilators, and we also have this mechanism to send stuff all over the country. And we've done that for years with paper-based exams. They print all the paper-based exams in Rockhampton, they send them all to Sydney, they send them all to Melbourne, they send the ones that they need to send out to the regional centres. And they did the same thing with USBs. And for us, initially, that was a positive for the electronic exam. We were able to say, well, that's great, you know, we'll just, instead of sending paper exams, send USBs. And the student, it will work exactly the same. Until last term. And last term, Ken gets an email about a week before the exam. There were 2 emails. The first one was about a week before the exam, saying, Ken, all the USBs for Sydney have gone missing. How many were there? 50?
Yeah,
Something like that. You're going to have to make 50 more. And you got a week to do it. And so he says, okay. And he makes 50 more and he sends them express post straight to Sydney this time instead of sending them to Rocky. The day before the exam, he gets another email or phone call? Email, I think.
Email.
Surprisingly, an email saying all the exams have gone missing for Melbourne
They should have rung me.
as well. Yes, they should have. That's what I said. Was it an email? And he has to burn a bunch of USBs for Melbourne as well, about 25 or something like that. Luckily, Ken's based in Melbourne. He's based here, so that was easy. He burnt them and he just literally dropped them over because otherwise, what we would have done, it was the day before. Which, of course, is a major security and integrity problem. I mean, I still lose some sleep thinking about those 70-odd exams of mine that are floating in the wind somewhere between Rockhampton and Melbourne and Sydney. Luckily, our university, like Andrew's university, we released the exam. So now that the exam is finished, now that we've certified all the results, we release the exam on the university website. So now all those USBs are essentially useless to students. They have the exam system on it, but that's fine. They can download the exam system from transformingexams.com if they want to. They're not really that helpful. So we kind of decided that USBs are a bit of a high risk for our particular situation and when there are lots of students involved. And so we've been talking to Mathew a little bit about networking, and as Mathew highlighted, we're getting towards this idea of some sort of networked online solution. But it's interesting because currently Mathew's doing a USB-based network online solution. So I was interested again to hear about some of the stuff that they're doing in Finland. Go for it.
Okay, this conclusion that you see up here goes right back to some of the things said earlier today about critical mass, where when we say about when we concluded 150, we're talking about one person trying to do it for the university. So obviously, if an entire department was involved, obviously it'd be a lot more than 150, as demonstrated by our 47,000, from Finland. A previous point made before was systems integration. You've got to make when you first start out with doing exams like we were, we really set up a very small operation with the blessing, of various university heads. But that's not really enough, is really what we've discovered. The reason for these limits is because a small unit really can't do it. That's what it boils down to. So you really have to have systems integration. Really means that you do have to involve all kinds of other things. You can't really do it on your own in a lab, especially if you're going to do it on real exams. This is sort of like a message to people that want to. Any of you may be starting to think about how we're going to get started and things like that. You need the organisation behind you. Coming back to the keynote this morning. And you really do need the infrastructure, and you need a lot of those things behind you in order to make it so that you can scale and you can do these things at a decent sort of a volume. So this is sort of like a one-man band statistics.
Guess who makes all the USBs? This is sort of the conclusion that we've come to, and so. So we're now looking at what we're going to do going forward, and I must admit that case study that I just gave you gives us a significant amount of pause. So what I'm going to do now is I'll talk to you a little bit about some of those categories that Andrew highlighted before. So Andrew actually highlighted 4 different systems. So I'm going to break those down a little bit and talk about the relative advantages and disadvantages of those, the features of those types of systems. And so. The first one, as I said to you, the one that everyone always talks about when you talk about e-exams is, should we have an invigilated 5 minutes already, wow. Okay. Should we have an invigilated exam or not? Should we have some sort of live supervision of those on-site exams? And the exam system, Mathew's exam system, is an invigilated exam system. It very much leans on the idea that everything remains the same except you get a USB and a computer instead of a paper-based exam, but all of the other processes are the same. It's one of the reasons that we adopted it at our institution, is because we thought we could sell it to the exams office, because it wasn't that, the workflow wasn't that different for them. So there are big advantages to that. You have direct control of the candidate's physical environment, so it minimises their cheating opportunities. You have uniform conditions for all the candidates, so that can be seen as fairer. That was really important for us with all of those exam centres. We have the ability for paper exams, use of paper exams or exam props, or to use external materials, and we can supervise what they're actually doing with those things. And as I said to you, the e-exam can pretty easily replace a paper exam but remain in the same invigilation practice. But you do end up with all of those disadvantages, those same disadvantages that you had for the paper-based exams. So the students still have to travel. And of course, again, this mostly impacts distance students, which is a big issue for us, and our university thinks about that a lot. You have the higher cost of setting up the suitable central venues and hiring all of the staff. I think a lot of institutions, I'm generalising, but I think some institutions, when they think about electronic exams, are looking at cost. And one of the big costs is all of those invigilators that they have to pay and the venues that they have to finance. So they want to get rid of that, and an invigilated exam is not going to do that. And then we've got a high impact on multi-exam site universities like CQU or others that will provide exams to remote students. And I mentioned that to you before with regards to the distance students. When we have a distance student in a particular location that is a true distance student, not near a campus, we have to organise an invigilator for that student. We have to find a venue, we have to organise an invigilator, and then that student has to go and actually sit the exam in the local church or the local lawyer's office or whatever we might have organised. And when you've got spotters of lots of different students all over the place, that can be quite a logistical challenge. So I think that the thing we really want is we want this idea of remote invigilation. We really want something that can be remotely invigilated using something like a webcam, using some of those mechanisms that Andrew was talking about before, measuring typing speed, listening to the audio, all of those kinds of things. And of course, they do this already. There are these systems that do this using a webcam, watching 8 or 10 students at a time, a single invigilator watching them via a webcam. Wow, 2 minutes. There's no travel cost, there's no time for the candidates, so it's familiar, it's comfortable, and of course we can record the session later if we want to as well. But the big disadvantage is that it gets harder to monitor them for cheating. And I don't necessarily think this is a problem that we've solved at this point. We can have webcams, we can have audio, we can have all of these kinds of things, but what happens if the student, wants to cheat? It's probably easier if there's not an invigilator in the room. Internet access obviously becomes really essential for that particular student, and it might not be available for them. That might be why they're a distance student in the first place. And then also, sometimes with these systems, in order to do it, they have the students sit there very, very still, sit in front of the camera so they can scan their face and check what they're doing, and the students find that to be a very uncomfortable position to be in. So they're the ups and downs of that particular thing. If we do a self-contained exam, so that's invigilated versus remote. Now let's talk about self-contained versus a network exam. A self-contained exam is an exam that that is entirely self-contained. So it's a paper-based exam, or it's an exam that you boot off a USB that doesn't actually require you to have a network. If you're doing an offline exam, e-exam, then this is considered a self-contained exam. Alternatively, if you're doing a network exam, then you're relying on a connection to the outside world. So a paper exam might give the students a chance to look at external websites. An e-exam uses some sort of secure network to actually do that, to use your own laptop or some sort of computer lab. And as I said to you, the e-exams project is up to this point now. And then last but not least, we have BYOD versus non-BYOD. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting ones, is whether or not the students bring their own device or they don't bring their own device. And I must admit this has been a challenge for us at CQU, and you might have noticed when I asked some of the presenters questions, I asked questions about that as well. The big advantage is that it's much more flexible, it's much lower cost to the university to do a BYOD exam, an exam where the students bring their own device. But you need a lot more testing. You need to make sure that all of the students' computers work. If you're booting from the USB, you need to change the settings. You need to make sure that it works with the network. You might need to have loaner computers, and that can be a little bit challenging. If it's non-BYOD, then you get the opportunity to use the university's computers, which is much better. But of course, there's a high cost for us to do that. Our experience so far is that the BYOD has been one of the biggest challenges for our particular students, and that might be the characteristics of students that we have at CQU. It might be the variety of students in the variety of different locations. But I think it's a serious consideration is whether BYOD works best. And that doesn't mean you can't have the other things. You can still have self-contained, you can still have network, you can still have it booting off a USB. It's just whether or not we get the students to use their own devices. I'm getting to hurry up. So to finish off, I'm gonna say that there are some things that we need to think about in terms of security and integrity. Overall, I think if we want to push e-exams forward, we need to be able to guarantee that they have the same level of integrity as a paper-based exam. As I said at the very beginning, I think this is the thing that people don't talk about, but I think it is ultimately for a lot of us why we do exams. If we can do that, we can guarantee that it has those levels of integrity and is lower cost, better pedagogy, you've got the chance to do more innovative exams, well then the university's probably going to accept it. You're going to get over some of that red tape and some of the bureaucracy that we were talking about this morning with Matt, and we're going to get better institutional support. The last slide here is a summary slide. It gives you a bit of a table. Mathew and Ken and I have been discussing some of these, in particular the reliability of the network exam. But if you want to have a look at the slides when you get them, this sort of summarises some of the stuff that I've been talking about. I think I'm probably going to leave it there because I got the zero about 2 minutes ago, and I'm going to give Geoff a chance to ask you if you've got any questions.
Yeah, please, any comments or questions?
As an exams person, the role of the invigilator is something that's important to us and that we've been reflecting on, and we do have our invigilator staff which come in, and they're older and they're younger and they're good at Excel, they're not good at Excel, all that kind of stuff. But the thing that I think will happen is that the staff that work for me in the university, our exams and assessment officers, if this happens and goes, they're going to be different. They're going to look different. They're going to need a different set of skills than they currently have. And that's something that we're looking at, because the person that runs these type of exams needs to be much more IT savvy, needs to be able to look at the systems, needs to be able to work with our academics. And for me, the other issue is the back end and getting our academics to get these things on the system and the quality network, the quality processes that have to go through so they get a high quality exam when they actually get it on the computer. That's my thing. So thank you.
I think that's great that you want some people that are more tech savvy, but I think we also need to come back to what Thomas was saying, which is that ultimately we want to convince people that this isn't that hard. And we found that with CQU, with all of these locations, we can't have a technical we could clone Ken 6 times and try and put him on every location, but I think that's going to be challenging. And so instead, I think what we want to do is try and make it a little bit more robust so that we don't need those technical experts. And again, these guys from across the world, I think they've done some great work in that area.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually have a comment about the BYOD, which I mean it was in the initial plans. There were considerations. Should we have like schools on computers or the students on computers? And for us, of course, cost is an issue. But the other issue was also that if we have like a hoard of laptops somewhere in the school's drawer that's taken out twice a year and the dust is brushed off from them, then actually those computers are much less reliable than the computers that the students use in their everyday practices.
That's right, and I mean, even if I think somebody said, you know, you will need some spare laptops, but at least you don't need 100%. But if we take Gabby's percentage of 10%, she allocates 10% of the amount of students in the room for spare laptops. 47,000, 10% of 47,000 is a lot of spare laptops. So I think, yeah, it's a difficult question.
I guess from the university's point of view, the big attraction of BYOD is just the sheer cost savings. Yeah, the big attraction of BYOD is just the sheer cost savings. Obviously, you know, the student doesn't have to buy and store all those computers. So I have a feeling that it's not going to go away. You know, the BYOD, we're going to have to make that option always possible. It's just a matter of how to do it. But the thing is, though, each succeeding generation of laptops is improving anyway over the previous one, and students do seem to have a habit of getting some, you know, a late model. I rarely see, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen a student come to class with a laptop that's 10 years old or something like that. You know, I've never actually seen it. Anyone do that? It's always one or two. Yeah, good. That's a very good point. I work in the IT school, so teaching IT students. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things as well. Implementing e-exams. It's all very well in the general school area we're doing it, but what about our nursing students? You know, architectural students and so forth. You know, I wonder how they'll go. Anyway, sorry.
Just a comment on the BYOD thing. I think that's a case where you need to make the financial business case as well as the academic case for it. So we've had academics say to us, well, I can't flip my class or do more active learning in the classroom because I don't know if my students have a device or not. I could be excluding someone, equity, rah, rah, rah. Therefore, that's their hurdle as to why they're not doing more active learning and better teaching. Whereas if you've got a BYOD program and you know you have some consistency and you have an equity program in place, then you can say to the academics, we've removed that hurdle for you. Now let's help you do some better stuff in the class. So I think you need to do both sides of it, not just the finances.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. And look, interestingly, I loved what Andrew said about how in Finland now the exams becoming so popular that the machines are getting marketed as a Bharti ready, right? You know, and I mean that's what we want eventually. Is we want to try and encourage students say this is the kind of computer that you need for the exam. Make sure this is the kind of computer that you buy. And if you don't have the money to buy that computer, well, you're going to need it. So here's an equity program to make sure that you can all get one. I don't feel like we're quite there yet in Australia, but it's a great place to aim for, I think.
It goes hand in hand with that comment Andrew made before about getting manufacturers to get in on that.
I was interested that you made the comment that very few candidates or students turn up with old computers, but that also presents the alternative problem that they're all turning up with new computers, so that your systems have to continually be updated to keep update with whatever newfangled changes the hardware suppliers decide to impose upon us. How much, particularly if you're using USBs, that's going to become more and more of a challenge.
That's it. If I say UEFI boot, and then you can watch Andrew and Mathew cringe. You're fixed now.
That's the point. You have to have continuous development. No technology is ever set and forget.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. But I must admit, it does worry me a little bit with USBs about the environmental concerns with them too. I mean, we have discovered that USBs, to be viable, needs to be, you know, ultra reliable, but that means replacing them very frequently. We found that if we use a USB more than about twice, its reliability falls quite a lot.
And you're not buying very good USBs. We've had ours for about 5 years and they're no problem.
Well, if I had USBs for 5 years, I'd be thinking about changing them about now. Seriously. So now, if you think about you know, dozens of universities, using thousands and thousands of USBs every term, where are all those USBs going to go? You know, it might sound like it's a problem distant from us now, but not really. It's just another one of those environmental issues that probably makes it unsustainable. But anyway, with Mathew's e-exam system, it's not, you know, the plan isn't staying with USBs anyway. We're evolving into robust networking models and things like that. I'm sure it's going to go that way. I just can't really see the world going to these little things like that. That's not going to happen, I don't think.
Okay, since we're coming up to afternoon tea, I thought we might just thank Mathew and Ken, and then we can